doesn't matter. Nietzsche's observation was this. He said, well, it's pretty clear that the scientific rationalists are going to demolish the substructure of Western religious belief, and then of course the substructure of that sort of belief all the way around the world. And there's going to be consequences to that. And he said there's going to be two consequences. And he predicted this, say in 1850, it's something like 1850 in Will to Power, it's unbelievable. He said that what's going to happen in Europe is that there'll be the rise of socialist / communist utopian schemes that will possess people, and that will produce a war, and the consequence of that war will be that hundreds of millions of people die. And he predicted that like 80 years before it happened. Well, maybe less if you think of the Russian Revolution as a precursor of that, which Dostoevsky would have certainly viewed it as a precursor of that. Now, so there's totalitarianism on one side. That's one of the dangers. Another danger is nihilism, and the nihilism emerges because you shatter the meaning structure within which action is conceptualized. And so those are like two emergent pathologies that threaten people. Now, if you talk to someone who's nihilistic, and rationalists are almost always nihilistic, especially if they're depressed, they'll say things like I already told you, what difference does it make anyways? Now, Dostoevsky played out those themes, for example, in a very, very powerful way in a number of his books. So, The Possessed, for example, it's funny because Dostoevsky and Nietzsche wrote at the same time, and Dostoevsky wrote literature and Nietzsche wrote philosophy, but they were doing exactly the same thing. In Dostoevsky's The Possessed, he talked about description of the Russian political, economic, ideological scene, and what he saw happening was that as people moved away from their enmeshment in a historically conditioned meaning system, so that was, say, Judeo-Christianity, that they started to become susceptible to utopian, rationalist utopian ideologies. It was so out with one belief system and in with another. And the other was more dangerous because like the religious system sort of emerged from the bottom up, and they were weird and mythical and difficult to understand from a rationalist perspective, whereas the utopian schemes were rational constructions, ideologies, very narrow, and they were just imposed on people. So for example, the communists would say, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, which sounds wonderful, but if you put it into practice, it's like it's instantly genocidal. So Nietzsche said, well, as the modern world suffers through the contradiction between scientific rationality and ritual religion, historically conditioned, the consequence of that is going to be that two pathologies will emerge. One is reliance on totalitarianism. And so I would say, to the degree that any of you are ideological, then you've succumbed to the one pole of post-religious pathology. And all you've done is replace adherence to one set of beliefs, even though religious beliefs are not precisely beliefs, with another that's rationally constructed and incredibly dangerous. He said, well, if it isn't going to be totalitarianism, it's going to be nihilism. But the thing that's so interesting about the existentialists is they make a forthright claim that regardless of whether or not the fact that people will turn to those alternatives is can be rationalized. It makes sense that it would happen. It's still pathological. It's like an a priori statement. So I could say, well, let's say you're nihilistic. You know, you have a lot of doubt about life's meaning and purpose, and it's like it's eating at you. It's a disease of the soul. And you come to me and you tell me 30 logical reasons why what you say has to be true. And I would say, those are excellent logical reasons, and you're making a very powerful argument. But it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. The fact that you're nihilistic means that you're infected with a pathology. And whether or not you can justify it rationally is completely irrelevant. All it means is that your rational mind is capable of spinning off a sequence of logical tricks. And the ultimate truth is, it's undermining your ability to live. And so it's wrong. Why is it wrong? I don't care why it's wrong. It's not relevant why it's wrong. What's relevant is you can't live like that. And that's an existential claim. Because the existentialists are interested in a different kind of truth. They would say that a truth you cannot live is not true. Because their definition of truth is different. It's predicated on action. And then the totalitarianism claim is the same thing. So let's say that you're an ardent right-winger, or you're an ardent socialist, or you're an ardent feminist, or an environmentalist, or who cares what the ism is. You've abstracted out a bunch of axioms, you develop a coherent representation of the world, and it's pathological. It doesn't matter what the content is. It's pathological because it's not you. It's not you. If it was you, then a million other people wouldn't believe it. So the existentialist would say, if a million other people believe it, it's definitely false. And they're not talking about scientific claims. That's a whole different order of discussion and description. They're merely making the point that you're an individual thing. And if you've been unable to particularize your experience, and you've replaced that with adherence to some sort of arbitrary and universal call to action or representation, you're pathological. It's a form of mental illness. And you might say, well, what's the evidence for that? Well, what we'll find out in the next lecture is the 20th century was evidence for that. Not so much for the nihilism aspect. I think that we're still in for that. Because I think we swung to totalitarianism first, and that didn't work. And so now, you see this in postmodernism, for example. It's an unbelievably nihilistic philosophy, because it claims that all meaning, for example, is reducible to motivations of power, which is like intellectually simplistic beyond belief. And it comes straight out of like 1950s Marxism. And you know, it's pretty much permeated the humanities and the study of literature at universities all over North America. It's sick beyond belief to teach young people that all meaning is relative. It's the last thing you guys need to hear when you're like 20. And the reason that people teach it is because they're more afraid that things might have meaning than they are afraid that things might not. Because you might ask yourself, well, here's two options. One is, it doesn't bloody well matter what you do. Who the hell cares? Who's going to know in 1,000 years? And everything's relative. Well, you think, God, nothing could be worse than that. Well, I can tell you something that would be worse than that. It's easy. Let's take the reverse. Everything you do matters. Okay, so what's the downside of that? It's like you don't get to get away with anything. Everything you do is important. It's linked to everything else. It's like, okay, now choose. You got a choice. You can either choose to believe, nihilistically, that nothing has any meaning. Well, you get to be depressed and anxious, and maybe you're impulsive because that's the only kind of pleasure you can find. But the advantage is, you don't have any responsibility. You can do whatever you want. And if a psychoanalyst would say, maybe that's why you believe it. That's a secondary gain, right? You think you believe it because you've derived it logically. It's like, yeah, sure. No. You believe it because it's in the best interest of the worst aspects of you to believe it. Because it justifies sloth and cynicism. Well, the opposite is, yeah, what you do matters. It's like, well, why not believe that? Well, try believing it seriously and see what happens. You take the existential claim seriously. One of them is, you make a mistake, especially one that you know is a mistake, you will absolutely pay for it. And worse, that you'll never get away with it. And worse than that, it'll domino out into the world. So not only will you pay for it, but the people that you're connected with will pay for it. There's always a price. It's like, well, you decide which of those two things is more terrifying. You know, when you read Freud, and Freud says, religion is a defense against death anxiety. Well, that's a good argument. But it is not by no means clear to me at all that the reverse of that, which is the idea that things have intrinsic meaning and that you have like an intrinsic responsibility, it's by no means clear to me that that's a comforting idea. It could easily be that the more comforting idea is that, you know, you're just a speck in a collection of specks and what you do doesn't matter. Well, you can sit and play video games for the rest of your life and it isn't going to make any difference. It doesn't have any significance. Well, if the opposite is true, you know, every time you do something pathological, especially if you know it's pathological, you tilt the whole world towards pathology. And so the existentialists would say of the 20th century, we just about annihilated ourselves. Once in 1962, and then once again in the early 80s. We're this far away from nuclear annihilation. You might ask yourself, well, why didn't we do it? And the existential answer would be, as a collective, human beings decided that it would be better to continue being than not to. And the way they decided that was by shifting the ratio of their pathological to honest behaviors a little bit more towards honesty. And you know, you might wonder about this sort of thing, if this kind of thing could possibly be true. Well, that's why I have you read Frankl and Solzhenitsyn. You know, they're not classic personality theorists, but it doesn't matter to me because they're getting at something that's deeper than the terror management theorists or the people who deal with positive illusions. They're trying to make a case based on the analysis of an entire bloody century. And the case is, society has become carnivorous and pathological in precise proportion to the degree that the individuals who make up that society become deceitful and irresponsible. And I've never encountered a political or economic analysis or claim that has anywhere near the power of that. But it's a terrifying proposition, even though what you get out of it is, well, your life is meaningful. Your life is meaningful. And then if all of a sudden you find that you're suffering unnecessarily, this is a weird thing too about meaning claims, you know. Someone's nihilistic, they come and talk to you, they say, well, my life has there's no meaning in my life. And I say, well, how do you feel about that? And they say, well, I'm really feeling bad. And then you say, well, that's a meaning. Feeling bad, being anxious, hurting, those are meanings. They're just not very good meanings. And so then you might also ask yourself, if your philosophy throws you in the direction of overwhelming negative emotion, anxiety, and pain, and that's a meaning, A, you might note, you're not going to argue yourself out of that. You know, which shows that there's a meaning basis. You can't just all of a sudden decide you're not hurting, you're not anxious. You don't have control over that. The meaning of your pain is completely impenetrable to your rational mind. So even if you're nihilistic, you have to admit to the meaning of negative emotion. Well, then what do? You just deny the existence of anything positive? Well, why is that reasonable? Maybe it's just that, well, you could be unlucky and maybe you're not well, you know, and maybe you have reasons to be suffering that have nothing to do with the way you're construing the world, because people do get unlucky. But there's always the possibility that the reason that things are so terrible for you is that you're inhabiting a pathological perspective.